16,000 workers. A clock tower larger than Big Ben. The world's largest sewing machine factory, building 80% of everything Singer sold across the globe. Today, shoppers push trolleys through an Asda built on those same floors. The tower is gone, its aluminium hands melted into ashtrays. The factory is gone, erased so completely that nothing remains to mark where 36 million machines were made. How does something that dominant, that permanent, that woven into a town it actually created disappear without a trace? Only the name on a railway station survives. Singer. A word still searching for its meaning. Chapter 1. The ruins. Stand at the corner of Kilbowie Road on a Tuesday morning. Watch the shoppers drift toward the automatic doors of the Clyde shopping centre. Watch the trolleys rattle across the car park toward the Asda. Listen to the traffic, the buses, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Scottish town going about its ordinary business. Now try to imagine something else. Try to imagine 16,000 people walking this ground, not shoppers, workers, streaming through iron gates before the sun was fully up, breath misting in the cold air, boots ringing on cobblestones. Try to imagine the sound that greeted them, a low, constant thunder of machinery that never stopped, day or night, decade after decade. A sound so permanent, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that when it finally ceased, people said the silence kept them awake. Try to imagine looking up and seeing not the flat roofline of a retail park, but a clock tower rising 200 feet into the Scottish sky. 4 faces, each one 26 feet across, larger than Big Ben, visible for 6 miles. The only timepiece most workers ever needed. The heartbeat of an empire. That tower stood for 79 years. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Blitz, when the Luftwaffe sent 400 bombers to try to destroy this place. It survived strikes and recessions and the slow grinding pressure of a changing world. It didn't survive the accountants. They pulled it down on a Friday afternoon in March 1963. Not because it was damaged, not because it was dangerous, because it was inefficient, because the space could be better used, because the men with the spreadsheets had decided that symbols were luxuries a modern factory couldn't afford. The hands were melted into ashtrays. 17 years later, the factory followed the clock into oblivion. And today, there is nothing left. Nothing to indicate that the largest sewing machine factory the world had ever seen once sprawled across these 100 acres. Nothing to mark where 36 million machines were built by hands that are now stilled. Nothing but a railway station that still bears the name, Singer, and the memories of those who remember what it meant to say you worked there. This is the story of how that happened. Not a prosecution, not a lesson. Just the truth about something that was built, something that mattered, and something that was lost. It begins, as these stories often do, with a man who had nothing, and the audacious belief that he could change the world. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more to come, and plenty more stories like this one. Chapter 2. The founder and origin. Isaac Merritt's Singer was not supposed to amount to anything. Born in 1811 in upstate New York, the 8th child of German immigrants, he was abandoned by his mother when his parents divorced. He was 12 years old. He ran away from home that same year, joining a travelling theatre troupe, and for the next 2 decades he drifted, working as a joiner, a lathe operator, an apprentice machinist, always returning to the stage whenever he could, always believing his true destiny was as an actor named Isaac Merritt. He was wrong about that, but he was right about something else. He understood, in a way that more educated men didn't, how things worked, how machines fitted together, how a design could be improved. In June 1850, at the age of 38, Singer walked into a machine shop in Boston to repair a sewing machine. It was a Lero and Blodgett, a clumsy, unreliable contraption that broke down constantly and produced ragged stitches that no seamstress would accept. Singer looked at it some more, and within 11 days he'd designed and built something better. His machine used a suspended arm with a horizontal needle. It had a presser foot that held the fabric steady. It could sew continuously on curved surfaces. It could produce 900 stitches per minute, faster than anything else on the market, faster than seemed possible. On the 12th of August, 1851, he received patent number 8294, and the world of domestic labour began to change. But Singer's genius wasn't just mechanical. He understood something about how ordinary people lived. Sewing machines were expensive, far beyond what a working family could afford. So Singer, along with his business partner Edward Clark, invented something that would prove nearly as revolutionary as the machine itself: hire purchase. Pay a little each month. Take the machine home today. For the first time, industrial technology became accessible to the people who needed it most. By 1860, Singer was the largest sewing machine manufacturer in the world. And Isaac himself, that abandoned boy from Pittstown, that failed actor, that restless drifter, died in 1875 in a mansion in Devon, leaving behind an estate of $13 million and 26 children by 5 different women. He never did become a great actor, but he built something that outlasted any performance. The company he left behind would outlast him by more than a century. And the decision that would define its greatest chapter, the decision to build on the banks of the Clyde, would be made by another man who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. George Ross Mackenzie was born in Scotland, emigrated to America in 1846, and joined Singer's first workshop as a cabinet maker in 1851. He rose through the ranks not through charm or politics, but through the quiet competence of a man who knew how to make things work. By 1863, he sat on the board of directors. By 1882, he was president of the Singer Manufacturing Company, responsible for building and equipping the factories that would feed the world's hunger for sewing machines. He understood that hunger was growing. Singer had won first prize at the Paris World's Fair in 1855, and international demand had exploded. By the 1870s, it was clear that shipping machines across the Atlantic made no sense. Not when you could build them closer to the customers who wanted them, avoiding the costs and delays and import duties that ate into profits. Mackenzie needed a site for Singer's first overseas factory, and he knew exactly where to look. He looked home. Scotland in the 1870s was a landscape of industrial ambition. The Clyde had become one of the great shipbuilding rivers of the world. Thread mills and iron foundries clustered along its banks. The workforce was skilled. Generations of men and women who understood precision, who could be trained to operate the most sophisticated machinery of the age. And, as Mackenzie noted with the hard pragmatism of a businessman, they were lowly paid. The site he chose was a stretch of farmland at Kilbowie, in the parish of Old Kilpatrick. It was largely rural, a collection of 4 farms, some scattered cottages, a landscape that had changed little in centuries. But it had everything Mackenzie needed: flat ground for building, access to road, rail and canal, proximity to the shipyards that were already drawing workers to the area, and room to grow. On the 8th of May, 1882, George Ross Mackenzie stood in a field surrounded by a large gathering and broke ground on what would become the largest factory in the world. He could not have known, none of them could have known, that they were not just building a factory. They were building a town. The settlement that would grow around these walls did not yet exist. It would not receive its official status as a burgh until 1886, 4 years after the first spade broke the earth. And when Clydebank did receive its coat of arms, it would include a sewing machine, because without Singer there would be no Clydebank at all. The man and the machine and the place were now bound together. What happened to one would happen to all. Chapter 3. The Rise. The works rose from the Scottish earth with astonishing speed. Robert McAlpine and Company, the firm that would become Sir Robert McAlpine, legendary builders of Britain's infrastructure, laid over 20 million bricks across the site. The architect Robert Ewan designed something unprecedented. 2 enormous buildings, each 800 feet long and 50 feet wide, 3 stories high, connected by wings and serviced by nearly 3 miles of internal railway track. 1 building for domestic machines, 1 for industrial. a clock tower rising from the central wing, waiting for the mechanism that would make it famous. The construction finished 6 months ahead of schedule. By the summer of 1884, production began transferring from Singer's cramped Glasgow premises. By 1885, the factory was complete, and it was, without exaggeration, the most modern factory in Europe. It was the first factory on the continent to install a water sprinkler system. The buildings were designed to be fireproof because the men who built them understood that a single blaze could undo decades of investment. The internal railway connected every department, foundry to boiler room, cabinet works to shipping, and linked the whole complex to the main Glasgow, Dumbarton and Helensburgh lines. A small jetty on the Forth and Clyde Canal allowed materials to arrive and finished products to depart by water. By the summer of 1885, the works had the capacity to produce 8,000 sewing machines every week. 3,500 workers clocked in through those gates, and this was only the beginning. The decades that followed were decades of relentless expansion. The original 3-story buildings were extended upward to 6. New structures rose across the site: a power station, a sawmill, a dedicated cabinet factory, vast storage facilities for the timber that would become the handsome wooden cases that made Singer machines objects of domestic pride. The 46 acres Mackenzie had purchased more than doubled, spreading across 100 acres of what had recently been farmland. The clock tower received its mechanism in 1886. 4 faces, each 20 feet across at first, displaying not just the time, but the name, Singer, in letters that could be read from the deck of a ship coming up the Clyde. In 1905, the faces were enlarged to 26 feet, filling their cast-iron frames entirely, each face weighing 5 tons. It took 4 men 15 minutes, twice a week, to wind the mechanism. The driving weight alone was over 1,000 kilograms of cast iron. And then, in 1907, something happened that captured the scale of what Singer had become. The nearby Kilbowie railway station was renamed. It would now be called Singer Station, one of only 2 stations in Britain named after a factory. At its peak, it would have 6 platforms, including private platforms within the factory grounds themselves, handling the daily flood of workers who arrived from across the region. The numbers tell part of the story. By the turn of the century, 7,000 workers. By 1911, nearly 12,000. By 1913, the year of peak production, 14,000 workers producing over 1.3 million sewing machines annually. More than any other factory. More than anyone had imagined possible. But the numbers don't capture what it felt like to see this thing in operation. To stand at the gates in the grey morning light and watch the tide of humanity flowing in. To hear the thunder of the machinery starting up, a sound that rolled across the town like weather, that rattled windows and vibrated through floors and announced every single day that this place was alive. The workers who streamed through those gates came from the terraced streets that had sprung up around the works like ivy around an oak. They came from Dalmuir and Drumry, from Hardgate and Duntocker, from the new housing that the factory's wages made possible. Whole families worked there, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, generation following generation, through the same gates, learning the same skills, taking the same pride in the same work. And the work itself? Everything was made on site. Everything. From the cast iron bodies to the wooden cabinets, from the smallest screw to the final polish. Raw materials entered at one end of this 100-acre complex, and finished sewing machines, gleaming, precise, ready to transform the domestic economy of the world, emerged at the other. Singer didn't just dominate the market, Singer was the market. By the early 20th century, the company sold more machines than all other manufacturers combined, and the Clydebank works produced 80% of Singer's global output. 80%. From this patch of former farmland beside the Clyde, machines flowed outward to every continent, every country, every home that could afford one. And thanks to hire purchase, that meant nearly every home. The competitors who had tried to challenge Singer's supremacy fell away one by one. Howe's machines, Grover and Baker, Wheeler and Wilson, names that had once seemed formidable, now forgotten. Singer survived them all. Singer survived the depressions and the downturns, the strikes and the setbacks. The works kept running, the clock kept ticking, and Clydebank kept growing. By 1914, the population of the burgh had exploded to over 43,000. In 1882, there had been perhaps 5,000 people living in this area. Singer had not merely built a factory. Singer had built a civilization. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it was like when everything worked. Picture the works floor on a Wednesday morning in 1962. Picture yourself walking through those gates, past the clock tower that still stands, though not for much longer, across the yard and into the main production building. The first thing you notice is the scale. Nearly 1 million square feet under one roof. 6 stories of organised chaos stretching away in every direction, the far ends of the building lost in a haze of movement and activity. Overhead, the girders disappear into shadow. Underfoot, the floor vibrates with a rhythm that never stops. The heartbeat of 10,000 machines all running at once. The second thing you notice is the sound. It's not noise exactly. Noise implies disorder. This is something else. A vast, encompassing roar that surrounds you completely, that enters your body through your feet and your chest as much as your ears. The stamping of the presses, the whir of the conveyor belts, the clang of metal meeting metal, the pneumatic hiss of tools. And underneath it all, the constant bass note of the power station, pumping energy through the veins of this enormous organism. William Sweeney, who started here in 1956 at the age of 15, would later remember, "I was a nervous wreck. The noise in there." He wasn't exaggerating. The sound was physical. It pressed against you. It became part of you. Workers who spent decades on that floor carried its echo in their heads long after they'd gone home. But they also learned to navigate it, to communicate through gesture and lip reading, to find the pockets of relative quiet where you could exchange a word with your neighbour. The sound became familiar, almost comforting. It meant the machines were running. It meant there was work. It meant the wages would be there at the end of the week. Walk deeper into the works and you begin to understand the workflow. Raw materials arrive at the foundry. Iron, later aluminium, timber for the cabinets, steel for the precision components. The foundry is its own world. Molten metal, glowing orange-white. The bang and crash of it hitting the moulds, the heat radiating outward in waves that you can feel from 20 feet away. Molten steel banging as it hit the moulds, as one worker remembered. The air smells of hot metal and casting sand, a thick industrial perfume that clings to your clothes. From the foundry, the components move through the labyrinth of departments. 41 separate departments by 1911, each with its own character, its own rhythms, its own small community of workers who knew every inch of their territory. The polishing department, where women buffed the metal bodies until they gleamed. The needle flat, where the tiny, precise components that did the actual sewing were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The motor assembly line, Department 47, nicknamed the beauty parlour because it was staffed entirely by women, and therefore, as the men joked, the department all the men wanted to visit. The cabinet works had its own smell, sawdust and varnish, the clean scent of freshly cut timber. The shipping department, near the canal jetty, had the bustle of constant movement, finished machines being crated, loaded, sent out into the world. The canteen had the warm, greasy smell of fried bacon and strong tea, the sounds of laughter and gossip and the clink of crockery, a brief respite from the thunder of production. And everywhere, the internal railway, 2 3/4 miles of track threading through the complex, small engines pulling wagons of components and materials, a constant circulation that kept the whole vast system supplied and functioning. Rita Kerr worked as an electric buffer. Her quota was 130 sewing machines per day. Every day. The same motion, repeated thousands of times until it became automatic, until your hands knew what to do without your mind having to tell them. This was Taylorism. Scientific management, imported from America, and it had extracted every possible efficiency from human labour. The rates were set to the speed of the fastest workers, and everyone else had to keep up. It was hard. It was relentless. The work was fragmented into tasks so small and repetitive that the craft had been squeezed out of them. And yet. There was something there, something that the efficiency experts and the time and motion men never quite captured on their clipboards. 16,000 people at the peak. 16,000 lives organised around these buildings, these machines, this rhythm. Who were they? They were Clydebank. They were the sons and daughters of Clydebank, and the sons and daughters of those sons and daughters. By the early 1960s, multi-generational employment wasn't unusual. It was the norm. William Sweeney's sisters worked there. Elizabeth Maitland's husband worked there, and her father-in-law, and both her parents. Families moved through those gates together, generation after generation, carrying knowledge and skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Singer was just like a small town with its own characters, Elizabeth Maitland remembered. And she was right. It had everything a town needed. Its own fire station with 2 engines, its own medical facilities, its own social clubs and societies. It had its own internal politics, its own hierarchies, its own legends and in-jokes and feuds. The day began before dawn for many workers. Up in the darkness, a cup of tea, the walk through terraced streets, past the corner shop, past neighbours heading the same direction, the crowd thickening as you approached the gates. The clock tower visible from streets away, telling you whether you were running late. The queue at the time clock, the clunk of your card punching in, and then the long walk to your department, through corridors that smelled of oil and metal and the particular damp of Scottish industrial buildings. The shift was 8 hours, though overtime was common and often expected. The work was tiring, the repetition, the noise, the concentration required to meet your quota without making mistakes that would be docked from your pay. But there were rhythms within the rhythm. The tea breaks, the dinner hour, the small conversations stolen when the foreman wasn't watching, the camaraderie of people who spent more waking hours with each other than they did with their own families. And there was the Friday wage packet. This was the ritual that made everything else worthwhile. The brown envelope handed over at the end of the week, the weight of it in your hand, the knowledge that this was real money, money that paid the rent, that put food on the table, that bought shoes for the children, and a pint at the club on Saturday night. A Singer wage wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. It was reliable. It was the foundation on which lives were built. No one ever thought Singer would close, Isa Mackenzie said years later, because it had been such a big part of our lives. That sentence captures something essential. Singer wasn't just an employer. It was the reason this place existed. It was the gravitational centre around which everything else orbited. The housing, the shops, the schools, the churches, the pubs. When you worked at Singer, you weren't just earning a living. You were participating in something larger. You were part of the machine. The trade unions were strong here, though management fought them every step of the way. Singer had imported American anti-union culture along with American management techniques, employing workforce spies, victimizing organisers, maintaining what Tom Bell called a regime where those union men that were employed had to keep it quiet. The 1911 strike, which we'll come to, had shown what happened when workers pushed back. 400 people sacked, every known union member dismissed. The message was clear. And yet solidarity persisted. It had to. The work was too hard, the power imbalance too stark, for people to face it alone. Workers looked out for each other. They covered for each other when someone was struggling to meet their quota. They shared information about which foreman to avoid and which shortcuts actually worked. The culture of the floor was not something management created or controlled. It grew organically, from the bottom up, from the simple human need to find meaning and connection in labour. By the 1960s, half of Clydebank's young women worked at Singer. Half. The polishing department, the needle flat, the motor assembly line. These were domains where women dominated, where the particular skills of precise, repetitive handwork were valued, where a young woman could earn her own wage and achieve a measure of independence that previous generations couldn't have imagined. But the best jobs, the skilled positions in the toolroom, the engineering roles, the supervisory posts, those remained largely male. The hierarchy of the works reflected the hierarchy of the world outside, with all its limitations and assumptions. Progress had come, but it had not come evenly. Walk out of those gates at the end of a shift, and you walked into a town that existed because you existed. The pubs filled up on Friday evenings, working men's clubs where a pint cost what a pint should cost, where the conversation was about football and families and what was happening on the floor. The co-op did steady trade in the necessities of working life. The churches and chapels drew their congregations from the terraced streets, marking the rhythms of birth and marriage and death that continued regardless of what happened inside the factory walls. The works hooter sounded 3 times a day: the start of the morning shift, the dinner break, the end of the day. You could set your watch by it, if you had a watch. Most people didn't need one. The hooter was the clock that mattered, the pulse that synchronized the town. When it sounded, the streets would suddenly fill with workers heading in one direction or another, a human tide that flowed and ebbed with mechanical regularity. The terraced houses had been built for workers like these, modest but solid, streets climbing the hillsides, front doors opening almost directly onto the pavement. From some streets you could see the clock tower rising above the rooftops, a constant reminder of where your livelihood came from. The architecture of the town was the architecture of industrial purpose, and Singer gave back, after a fashion. Walter J. Rickey, the works manager from 1913, established a recreation fund that transformed the social life of the workforce. The Singer Recreation Hall and Grounds opened in 1921, offering facilities that most workers could never have afforded on their own. There were monthly dances, an annual Caledonian Ball, camera clubs and pipe bands, badminton courts and football teams. The Singer Gala Day became a massive annual event. Thousands taking part, the streets lined with spectators, a parade that celebrated the community Singer had created. Each year, a Singer Gala Queen was crowned, a young woman chosen from the workforce to represent the pride and spirit of the place. Elizabeth Maitland held that honour in 1965, the last queen before the tradition ended. The Singer Bowling Club, founded in 1921, still exists today, one of the few physical remnants of a social world that has otherwise vanished entirely. All of this, the clubs, the societies, the rituals, the gatherings, served a purpose beyond entertainment. It bound people together. It created loyalty. It made Singer more than just a place you worked. It made Singer a community. And communities are harder to abandon than jobs. By the early 1960s, Singer Clydebank had reached a pinnacle that would never be equalled. The numbers were staggering. Over 16,000 employees, more than many Scottish towns had residents. 100 acres of industrial complex. Machines flowing out to every corner of the globe, Singer's name synonymous with sewing itself. In many languages, the word for sewing machine was simply Singer. The company's dominance was almost total. Singer sold more machines than all other manufacturers combined. The Clydebank works alone produced 80% of the company's global output. When you bought a sewing machine, anywhere in the world, the odds were overwhelming that it had been built here, on this patch of Scottish ground, by these Scottish hands. The quality was part of the legend. A Singer machine wasn't cheap, but it was built to last. Families bought them knowing they'd survive decades of daily use, knowing they could be passed down to children and grandchildren. The wooden cabinets were handsome pieces of furniture. The mechanisms were precise and reliable. The name on the front meant something. It meant craftsmanship, it meant durability, it meant this thing won't break. Royal warrants attested to the quality. Export success proved the global appeal. In the years before the First World War, Russia alone imported half of Kilboe's output. Millions of machines flowing eastward to clothe a vast empire. The workers knew what they were part of. There was pride in building something that mattered, something that people wanted, something that would still be working long after you'd retired. When you told someone you worked at Singers, they knew what that meant. It meant stability. It meant skill. It meant you were part of something larger than yourself. The clock tower presided over all of it. 200 feet of Scottish baronial ambition, its faces larger than Big Ben's, its mechanism wound twice weekly by the same team of 4 men who'd been doing it for decades. Sailors coming up the Clyde used it as a beacon. When you could see the Singer clock, you were almost home. The tower had become so much a part of the landscape that imagining Clydebank without it was like imagining a body without a heart. Standing at this summit, 16,000 workers, 100 acres, 36 million machines built and counting. Nobody inside those walls could imagine what was coming. The decisions that would unmake this empire were still years away. The forces that would make those decisions inevitable were already gathering, but they were invisible, statistical, abstract. What was concrete was the thunder of the machinery, the weight of the wage packet, the solid permanence of brick and iron and glass. This was the peak, the highest point before everything changed. Chapter 5. The peak moment. The clock tower came down on a Friday, the 15th of March 1963, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Provost F. Downey pressed a button, and the hands stopped forever. For 79 years those 4 faces had marked the time for the workers below, the only clock most of them ever needed. Now the mechanism fell silent. The hands were fixed at their final position, and then the demolition began. Within weeks, the tower that had survived 2 world wars, that had guided sailors up the Clyde, that had defined the skyline of Clydebank, was reduced to rubble. The cast iron clock faces, each weighing 5 tons, were broken up. The aluminium hands were melted down. Someone had the idea of casting them into souvenir ashtrays, small mementos of something that had once seemed permanent. The official reason was efficiency. The company was modernizing, restructuring, preparing for a future that required flexibility rather than sentiment. The tower occupied space that could be better used. The cost of maintenance couldn't be justified. The spreadsheet said it had to go. But everyone understood what it really meant. You don't tear down a symbol unless you've stopped believing in what it represents. The clock tower wasn't just a timepiece. It was a statement of confidence, of permanence, of pride. Its destruction announced more clearly than any memo could have that the old certainties were ending. The worst thing that happened was taking down the clock, one former worker remembered, because you could check the time wherever you were in the town. She meant more than the inconvenience of needing a wristwatch. She meant that something orienting had been removed, something that told you where you were and what mattered. The clock had been the fixed point around which the town revolved. Without it, the centre no longer held. And yet, the factory kept running. The £7.8 million modernisation programme continued. Employment remained above 16,000. The machines kept flowing off the production lines, Singer's name still printed on everyone. From the outside, nothing essential seemed to have changed. But the workers who remembered the clock knew better. They could feel the difference, even if they couldn't articulate it. Something had shifted. Some unspoken contract had been broken. The company that had built this place, that had created this town, that had employed their fathers and grandfathers and would, they'd assumed, employ their children and grandchildren, had demonstrated that nothing was sacred. Not even the clock. The demolition of the tower was not the beginning of the end. The seeds of decline had been planted years earlier in decisions made in boardrooms an ocean away, in competitive pressures that were only beginning to be felt. But the clock was the first visible sign, the first crack in the facade. In 1913, at the absolute peak of production, 14,000 workers had built over 1.3 million sewing machines in a single year. 50 years later, the workforce was larger than ever, but the certainty was gone. The future that had once seemed as solid as the clock tower itself had become something else entirely. Something fragile. Something conditional. Something that could be taken away. The factory would survive another 17 years. The workers would continue to arrive at Singer Station, continue to walk through the gates, continue to build machines that bore a name known around the world. But the weight of those years would be different. The hum of the machinery would carry a different resonance, because now they knew that nothing was permanent. They knew that the decisions being made above them, in Glasgow, in New York, in boardrooms they would never see, could unmake in months what generations had built. 1963 was not the end. But standing in its shadow, looking at the empty space where the clock tower had been, you could see the end approaching. You could feel it in the air, like the change in pressure before a storm. The machines kept running, the shifts kept changing, the wage packets kept arriving on Fridays. But the silence where the clock had been, that silence would only grow. Chapter 6. Seeds of Decline. To understand how the end came, you have to understand what this place had already survived. On the 21st of March 1911, 12 women in the cabinet polishing department refused to do what they were told. Management had removed 3 workers from their team of 15. The remaining 12 were expected to absorb the extra work. No additional pay, no negotiation, just the assumption that they would comply, because what choice did they have? They chose to walk out. By the end of that first day, 380 of the 400 workers in the polishing department had joined them. By the following morning, 2,000 were on strike. By noon, the number had reached 10,000. Within 48 hours, only 1,500 of the 12,000 workers at Singer remained at their posts. It was, as the socialist leader John Maclean wrote at the time, the most significant event in this plucky revolt of women workers. And it terrified the company. Singer's management was, as Maclean put it, Yankee from stem to stern. They had imported not just American machinery, but American attitudes, a hostility to organised labour that ran bone deep. The company employed spies on the factory floor. Workers suspected of union sympathies were quietly dismissed. Tom Bell, who worked there, remembered that the firm refuses to recognise any union, and those union men that were employed had to keep it quiet. But the women of the polishing department hadn't waited for union permission. They hadn't filed grievances through proper channels. They had simply stopped. And in stopping, they had revealed something that management preferred not to acknowledge. Without the workers, the machines were just metal. For 3 weeks, Clydebank held its breath. Strikers marched to the John Brown shipyard, accompanied by the Duntucher brass band, seeking solidarity from fellow workers. The Glasgow Herald described, "One of the most impressive spectacles in the recent history of industrial strife. The company's response was calculated and ruthless. They threatened to move production to Russia, to Germany, to America. They warned that strikers would find difficulty in procuring other employment, a threat that carried weight in a town where Singer was the only game in town. And then they deployed their most effective weapon, a postcard referendum sent directly to workers' homes. The cards weren't anonymous. Management knew exactly who had signed and who hadn't. The timing was precise. Wages had run out, savings were exhausted, families were hungry. On the 7th of April, the ballots were counted, 6,527 for returning to work, 4,025 for continuing the strike. On the 10th of April, the workers went back. They had won nothing, no concessions, no recognition, no change to the policies that had sparked the walkout in the first place. But the company wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, over 400 workers were sacked. Every identified strike leader, every known union member, every woman who had stood on that picket line. Arthur McManus, one of the organisers, was dismissed and blacklisted. He would go on to become the first chairman of the Communist Party of Great Britain, his ashes eventually interred in the Kremlin wall. Jane Ray, one of the original 12 who walked out, was sacked and never worked at Singer again. Decades later, the town would name a garden in her honour. The 1911 strike was crushed, but it was not forgotten. It became part of the collective memory of Clydebank, proof that the workers had once stood together, that they had shaken the mighty Singer, that resistance was possible even if victory was not. And it marked the beginning of what historians would later call Red Clydeside, a decade of industrial militancy that would reshape Scottish politics. The company learned something too. They learned that workers could be pushed, but only so far. They learned that the appearance of paternalism, the recreation clubs, the gala days, the carefully managed benevolence, was cheaper than the reality of confrontation. The strike of 1911 created a kind of armed truce that would last for decades. But truces, by their nature, are temporary. 30 years later, a different kind of destruction came to Clydebank. On the night of the 13th of March 1941, the air raid sirens sounded at 9 o'clock. It was a clear, frosty evening. The moon was full. The town had experienced dozens of false alarms over the previous 18 months, and many people barely looked up from what they were doing. The 7 cinemas were full. The council had just finished a meeting at the town hall. Then the bombs began to fall. The Luftwaffe had identified Clydebank as a strategic target. The Admiralty oil storage facility at Dalnotar, the John Brown shipyard where warships were being built, and the Singer factory, which had converted to munitions production, turning out fuses, shells, grenades, rifle parts, everything an army at war required. Over 2 nights, 439 German bombers dropped 272 tons of high explosives and over 100,000 incendiary devices on the town. The Singer timber yard, 40 acres of carefully stacked wood, went up in flames that could be seen for miles. The Auchentoshan distillery exploded, 1 million bottles of whiskey feeding a river of fire that ran down to the Clyde. The devastation was almost total. Of the 12,000 houses in Clydebank, only 7 or 8 escaped damage entirely. 4,000 were completely destroyed. Another 4,000 were severely damaged. 35,000 people, the vast majority of the population, were made homeless in 48 hours. 528 people died. Another 600 were seriously injured. 39 of the dead were Singer workers, killed not at the factory, but in their homes, in the terraced streets that had grown up in the shadow of the works. The factory itself took direct hits. 390,000 square feet of production space was destroyed. The timber yard was gone. The damage seemed catastrophic. And yet, 4 days after the bombing, work on war contracts resumed. Within 6 weeks, full production had returned. The workers who had survived walked back through those gates, past the rubble, past the still smoking ruins, past the gaps where buildings had stood, and they got back to work. Because the war wasn't going to wait, and neither were they. The clock tower, improbably, survived. 200 feet of Victorian stonework standing untouched amid the destruction, its 4 faces still marking time over a landscape of ruins. It would take peacetime economics, not German bombs, to finally bring it down. The Blitz became part of Clydebank's identity, proof of what the town could endure, what it could survive, what it could rebuild. The community that emerged from those 2 nights was scarred, but not broken. Families who had lost everything started again. Workers who had seen their colleagues die returned to the factory floor. The rhythm of production resumed, because that was what this place did. It made things. It kept going. Clydebank had survived the worst that war could throw at it. Surely, people thought, surely now the hard times were over. The decades after the war were good years. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but good. Employment remained high. The machines kept selling. The wages kept coming. The modernisation programme of the early 1960s suggested that management saw a future worth investing in. But beneath the surface, pressures were building that would eventually prove irresistible. The first pressure was competition. Japan, rising from the ashes of its own war, was building new factories equipped with the latest technology. Japanese sewing machines were well made and cheap. Cheaper than anything Singer could produce in its ageing Scottish facilities. American trade deals flooded the US market with Japanese imports, undercutting Singer in its home territory. The second pressure was changing tastes. The heavy, cabinet-mounted sewing machines that had been Singer's speciality were falling out of fashion. Consumers wanted portable, lightweight models. They wanted machines that could be stored in a cupboard, not furniture that dominated a room. In 1966, Singer closed its woodwork division, eliminating 1,200 jobs at a stroke. Changing fashions, management explained, as if fashion were a force of nature rather than a signal that should have been heeded years earlier. The third pressure was demographic. More women were working outside the home. They had less time for sewing, less need for elaborate domestic machines. The ready-made clothing industry was producing garments cheaper than any home seamstress could match. The fundamental economics of domestic sewing were shifting, and Singer, wedded to a product that had conquered the 19th century, was slow to adapt. The fourth pressure was the factory itself. 100 years of continuous operation had taken their toll. The buildings that had seemed so modern in 1885 were now antiquated, their layouts inefficient, their machinery outdated. The old-fashioned management and antiquated machine tools, as one observer put it, were becoming a competitive liability. Modernisation helped, but it couldn't transform a Victorian factory into a modern production facility. And the fifth pressure, perhaps the most dangerous, came from an ocean away. The Singer Company in America was struggling. The parent company had run up enormous debts pursuing diversification strategies that failed more often than they succeeded. The core sewing machine business was declining, squeezed by Japanese competition and changing markets. Executives in New York were looking for costs to cut, assets to sell, operations to close. Clydebank, with its ageing facilities and its relatively expensive Scottish workforce, was beginning to look less like a jewel in the corporate crown and more like a problem to be solved. Through the early 1970s, the redundancies began. Not dramatically at first, a few hundred here, a few hundred there. By 1972, the workforce that had once numbered 16,000 was down to 6,000. The production lines were still running, the machines were still being built. But the direction was unmistakable. The workers could feel it. The old-timers who remembered the peak years, who remembered when the car parks were full and the shifts were packed and the future seemed assured, they could feel the difference. The energy was draining away. The confidence was gone. And in the boardrooms of New York, the conversations that would seal Clydebank's fate were already beginning. Chapter 7. The Fatal Decisions. The man who would decide Clydebank's fate was named Joseph B. Flavin. He had come to Singer from Xerox and IBM, a corporate turnaround specialist brought in to save a company that was bleeding money. He looked at the numbers and saw what the numbers showed: a global operation hemorrhaging cash, burdened by obsolete facilities and outdated products, facing competition it couldn't match on price and struggling to match on quality. Flavin understood that something had to give. The question was what? In 1978, Singer proposed reducing the Clydebank workforce from 4,800 to 2,000. The announcement sent shockwaves through the town. Trade unions mobilised. The Scottish Development Agency scrambled to find alternatives. Shop stewards lobbied the Labour Party conference. The government offered financial assistance to keep industrial machine production going. For a moment, a brief moment, it seemed possible that a deal might be struck, that some version of the factory might survive, that the worst could be avoided. Then came the 4th of May, 1979. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party won the general election. The new government had different priorities, different assumptions, different ideas about what the state should and shouldn't do to preserve industrial employment. The negotiations that had been progressing under Labour collapsed. The financial assistance that had been promised became uncertain. The political ground shifted beneath Clydebank's feet. On the 12th of October 1979, Joseph Flavin confirmed what many had feared. The factory would close. All of it. Not a reduction, not a restructuring, but a complete shutdown. Production would move to Taiwan and Brazil, where labour costs were a fraction of Scottish levels. The announcement used the language of corporate necessity. Part of a sweeping programme to restructure, consolidate and streamline. The regret was described as deepest. The logic was sound on paper. Singer couldn't compete with Japanese prices while paying Scottish wages. The Clydebank facility, for all its history, for all its symbolism, for all the generations who had walked through its gates, was a drag on the balance sheet. The numbers said it had to go. What the numbers couldn't show was what would happen to the town that Singer had built. What the spreadsheets couldn't calculate was the cost of destroying a community's reason for existing. The models that justified the closure had no line item for pride, for purpose, for the web of relationships that held a place together. Perhaps Flavine and his colleagues genuinely believed there was no alternative. Perhaps they had looked at every option and concluded that gradual decline would be worse than a clean break. Perhaps they told themselves that the workers would find other jobs, that the town would recover, that the pain would be temporary. Or perhaps they simply didn't think about it very much. Perhaps Clydebank was just a pin on a map, a line in a ledger, a problem to be solved, and then forgotten. Perhaps the people who made the decision never had to look into the eyes of the people who would live with its consequences. The rescue attempts continued through the winter of 1979 and into 1980. Trade unions lobbied. Politicians made speeches. The Scottish Development Agency offered incentives. None of it mattered. The decision had been made. The machines would stop. Chapter 8. The Collapse. The factory closed in June 1980. There was no ceremony, no moment of recognition, no gathering of the 16,000 workers who had once filled these buildings, no acknowledgement of the 36 million machines they had built, no tribute to the nearly 100 years of continuous production that were coming to an end. There was just a date on a calendar, and then silence. The final months had their own terrible rhythm. Workers who had spent their entire adult lives on that floor came in each day knowing they were building toward nothing. The skills they had developed over decades, the precise knowledge of how this machine fitted together, how that component should be finished, what quality looked like and felt like, all of it was becoming worthless. Not because the skills had changed, but because no one would need them anymore. Some workers signed the last machines they built, scratched their names into the metalwork, in places where no one would see. Small acts of defiance, or grief, or simply the need to leave some mark on a world that was disappearing. Isa Mackenzie, who had worked at Singer for decades, remembered the disbelief. No one ever thought Singer would close because it had been such a big part of our lives. William Sweeney, who had started as a boy of 15 and was now a man approaching retirement, struggled to articulate what the closure meant. I was very, very sad when the factory closed down. It affected the whole town. 3,000 workers lost their jobs in that final shutdown. 3,000, a number that sounds almost modest compared to the 16,000 of the peak years. But that comparison only underscores how much had already been lost. For a decade, the workforce had been bleeding away through redundancies and early retirements, each cut presented as necessary, each reduction accepted in the hope that the core would survive. The core did not survive. For the people of Clydebank, Elizabeth Maitland said, it was like losing a member of the family. That phrase captures something important. A family member isn't just someone who lives in your house. A family member is part of your identity, your history, your sense of who you are and where you belong. When a family member dies, you don't just lose their presence, you lose part of yourself. Singer had been there before Clydebank existed. Singer had built the houses these workers lived in, created the jobs their parents had worked, sponsored the clubs where they socialised, wound the clock that marked their days. For nearly a century, the rhythm of the factory had been the rhythm of the town, the hooter that called workers to their shifts, the flood of humanity through the gates at changing time, the pay packets that sustained the shops and pubs and churches. All of it gone. The unemployment figures tell part of the story. Clydebank's rates soared. Across Clydeside, joblessness rose from 10% in 1971 to 21% at its peak. In Glasgow proper, it reached 26%. The closure of Singer was not the only cause. Linwood, Bathgate, the shipyards, the steelworks, an entire industrial ecosystem was collapsing simultaneously. But Singer was the wound that Clydebank felt most keenly. Because Singer wasn't just an employer. Singer was why this place existed. The workers scattered. Some found other jobs. Those who were young enough, adaptable enough, lucky enough. Some took early retirement and tried to make peace with a future they hadn't chosen. Some never really recovered. The retraining programs helped some and failed others. The promises of new industries, new opportunities, new beginnings. Some came true and many didn't. The silence spread outward from the factory floor. The pubs that had filled on Friday evenings grew quieter. The shops that had served the workforce closed their doors. The terraced streets that had housed generations of Singer families began to empty as people left to find work elsewhere. And through it all, the building stood, empty, waiting. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The Scottish Development Agency moved quickly. Within weeks of the closure, they had purchased the Kilbowie site. A task force was assembled. £15 million were committed to regeneration. Clydebank was designated as Britain's first enterprise zone, a laboratory for the belief that tax breaks and deregulation could spark new economic life in the ashes of the old. In 1981, the bulldozers arrived. The demolition of the factory buildings proceeded methodically, without sentiment. The structures that had once housed the most productive sewing machine operation in the world were reduced to rubble and carted away. The railway sidings were torn up. The internal roads were erased. Slowly, steadily, every physical trace of what had been was removed. Only one thing survived. The name on the railway station. Singer Station, where 6 platforms had once handled 12,000 workers a day, was reduced to 2 platforms serving an ordinary suburban commute. But the name remained, a small, stubborn memorial to something that no longer existed. The site was reimagined as Clydebank Business Park. Modern units, light industrial, clean lines. The brochures promised a new future. And in a bitter irony that seemed almost calculated, the first tenant of the new development was Singer itself. An engineering office employing exactly 6 people. 6. In buildings that had once held 16,000. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the regeneration continued. The Clyde shopping centre opened, promising to provide a new heart for a town disfigured by industrial decline. An Asda supermarket rose on ground where polishing departments and assembly lines had once operated. The business park filled with offices and small enterprises that had no connection to sewing machines, no memory of what this land had been. The change was total. Today, if you walk through the Clyde shopping centre, past the Primark and the Home Bargains and the Empire Cinema, there is nothing at all, to indicate that you are walking on ground where 36 million sewing machines were built. No plaque, no memorial, no preserved fragment of machinery or brick. The erasure is complete. But memory is harder to demolish than buildings. The workers who survived carried their stories with them. The pride they had felt, the skills they had developed, the friendships they had formed on that factory floor, these things couldn't be bulldozed. Oral history projects captured their testimonies. The local museum collected their artefacts. 800 sewing machines, including the first ones built in Britain and the last one built at Clydebank, were preserved as a collection of national significance. William Sweeney, looking back decades later, tried to explain what Singer had meant. I don't think the younger generation realises what Singer's or John Brown's meant to the town. He was right. How could they realise? The world that Singer had created, the stability, the purpose, the certainty that hard work would be rewarded and the future would resemble the past. That world is as foreign to the younger generation as the Victorian era was to William's own grandparents. The transformation has been that complete. And yet something persists. Not the buildings, not the machines, but the knowledge that something was here, that something mattered, that an entire way of life was built on this ground, flourished, and then was swept away. Chapter 10. The Ruins Today. There are no ruins. That's the thing that strikes you, standing at the corner of Kilbowie Road on an ordinary afternoon. The word ruins implies something remaining, broken walls, rusted machinery, visible traces of what once was. But Singer Clydebank has been erased so thoroughly that even the ruins are gone. Where the clock tower stood, there is now a gap in the skyline filled by anonymous modern buildings. The business park occupies the footprint with tidy efficiency, its architecture designed to be forgettable. The shopping centre hums with the ordinary commerce of a struggling Scottish town. Pensioners browsing the discount stores. Teenagers killing time. The ambient music that sounds the same in every mall in Britain. Walk through the Asda car park. The trolleys rattle across tarmac that covers the ground where the foundry once poured molten metal into moulds, where the polishing department buffed machines to a mirror shine, where 16,000 workers once arrived for the morning shift. Nothing marks the spot. Nothing interrupts the smooth functionality of retail logistics. Singer Station still stands, reduced, diminished, but operational. 2 platforms where there were once 6. A modest shelter where workers once crowded by the thousand. The name remains on the signage, and if you didn't know the history, you might wonder what it meant. Singer? What's Singer? The Forth and Clyde Canal still runs nearby, though the jetty that once loaded finished machines onto barges is long gone. The canal is a leisure amenity now, walked by joggers and cyclists who have no reason to think about what this waterway once carried. Stand on the site where the factory stood and try to summon the sounds, the thunder of the machinery, the voices of workers, the works hooter marking the shifts. Try to smell the machine oil, the hot metal, the canteen frying bacon in the early morning. You can't. The sounds are gone. The smells are gone. The buildings are gone. What remains is absence, a void where something important used to be. But walk into the town and something else emerges. The terraced streets that house the workers still climb the hillsides, though their inhabitants now commute to jobs that have no connection to sewing machines. The pubs still stand, though they're quieter now, serving a different clientele. The town continues, as towns do, adapting to circumstances it didn't choose. Clydebank today is one of the most deprived areas in Scotland. 12 of its 34 statistical zones rank among the most deprived 10% in the country. The unemployment that followed the closure has left deep scars, transmitted across generations. The regeneration projects helped, but they couldn't replace what was lost. And yet, the Singer collection at the museum preserves over 800 machines, the largest publicly accessible collection in Europe. Former workers give tours, explaining to visitors what these machines meant, how they were built, what it felt like to be part of something that mattered. The oral history recordings capture voices that might otherwise have been forgotten. The bowling club still plays. The name on the station still stands. Singers built Clydebank, a local newspaper wrote, reviewing a documentary about the factory, and Bankies still help build the world. There's defiance in that sentence, a refusal to be defined entirely by loss, an insistence that the people who remain are more than the remnants of something that disappeared. Chapter 11. What remains? The machines that were built here are scattered now across the world. In villages in Africa and Asia, Singer sewing machines, some of them nearly a century old, are still in daily use. The quality that Clydebank workers took such pride in has proved durable beyond anything the accountants could have predicted. Families who have never heard of Scotland, who couldn't find Clydebank on a map, rely on machines that were assembled by hands now stilled, checked by eyes now closed, approved by workers whose names are lost to history. In 2019, a BBC documentary followed restored Singer machines as they were shipped from Scotland to Ghana, where they were given to young women learning to sew. "Having a sewing machine is going to change my life big time," one of the recipients said. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that she was holding something that represented 100 years of skill, of pride, of community. She only knew that it worked. That's something. It's not enough, but it's something. What happened to Singer Clydebank was not unique. Across Britain, across the industrial heartlands that had built the modern world, the same story played out with variations. The shipyards closed, the steelworks fell silent, the mines were sealed, the mills stopped running. An entire way of life, a way of life that had given meaning and purpose and dignity to millions of people, was dismantled in the space of a generation. The reasons were complex. Competition from countries with lower wages. Technology that made old methods obsolete. Management that failed to adapt. Governments that chose not to intervene. Markets that rewarded efficiency over community. No single villain. No simple explanation. Just the slow, grinding pressure of forces that seemed irresistible and perhaps were. But understanding the reasons doesn't diminish the loss. What was lost at Clydebank wasn't just employment. It was a way of understanding yourself and your place in the world. It was the knowledge that your father had walked through those gates and his father before him, and that your children would follow. It was the pride of making something that mattered. Something you could point to and say, I built that. It was the community that formed around shared labour, the friendships forged on the factory floor, the rituals of shift changes and Friday wages and annual galas. It was, in the end, a kind of belonging, a sense that you were part of something larger than yourself, something that would outlast you, something worth being part of. That's what the shopping centre replaced. That's what the Asda covers. That's what the business park has erased from the landscape, if not from memory. William Sweeney, reflecting on everything that had been lost, allowed himself one small hope. I would like to think there's someone in Clydebank who will invent something and bring something back to the town. Perhaps they will. Perhaps somewhere in Clydebank today, a young person is nurturing an idea that will create something new, something that will matter, something that will give this place a new reason for existing. Stranger things have happened. The town that Singer built from nothing might yet be rebuilt around something else. But that's speculation. What we know for certain is what was. For nearly 100 years, this patch of Scottish ground was home to the largest sewing machine factory the world had ever seen. 16,000 people walked through those gates. 36 million machines were built by their hands. A clock tower larger than Big Ben marked the time. A community grew up in its shadow. A community that survived strikes and wars, that rebuilt after devastation, that believed in its own permanence. And then it ended. Not with bombs or fire or dramatic collapse. Just a decision made in a boardroom, a date on a calendar, and then silence. The silence remains. But if you stand at Singer Station on a quiet morning, waiting for a train that will take you somewhere else, you might feel something. A vibration in the ground that isn't there. An echo of machinery that stopped decades ago. The ghost of a works hooter calling workers to a shift that will never begin. Almost. What remains is the name on the station, the machines in the museum, the stories that the old-timers still tell when anyone thinks to ask. And the question that nobody answered in time. What happens to a place when its reason for existing disappears?